So today we're going to talk about China's influence campaign targeting the Hong Kong protests, what the data really tell us. And before we kind of jump into the slides here, just some context for those who perhaps aren't familiar. Hong Kong has been undergoing months-long protests now that originally started regarding an extradition bill that was to allow the extradition of criminal suspects from Hong Kong to mainland China. That kind of precipitated the civil unrest that has really now grown into a much broader protest movement regarding mainland China's treatment of Hong Kong. And so, as part of this, there's been a lot of reporting about what has China been doing in the social media space to try to influence attitudes towards these protests. So before we kind of dig into the content, I want to make a few disclaimers here. First, we're not making an attribution claim here. A number of organizations, social media platforms have stated that the assets they've identified to be part of this campaign are linked to Chinese state actors. We don't have the evidence to suggest that, so I'm not going to stand up here and say that. What we will say is that everything that you see in this presentation, we do make an assessment to be all part of the same kind of large-scale concerted effort to shape attitudes regarding the protests. My second disclaimer here is that this is not about platforms, it's about researchers. And the reason I say that is that I know I've got a lot of journalist friends in the room right now who look like I'm about to hand them a steak on a plate. I'm not about to throw anybody under the bus, so get that out of your mind right now. And this is really actually important to acknowledge here that all of the platforms themselves have different criteria, both by which they opt to release data regarding operations that they've uncovered, and also different definitions as to what actually constitutes information operations in their eyes. And so it's important to keep in mind those differences here when we start to talk, when I start to talk in the second half about comparing publicly released data with data that you as a researcher have collected yourself. And so, as I mentioned, this really is a talk geared towards researchers. I'm trying to communicate this idea that if you are trying to develop a holistic understanding of the nature of information operations as they play out, it's important to also do your own collection and not just rely on data that is subsequently publicly released. And then my third disclaimer here, this is not exhaustive, and I mean this in two ways. First, there's no way we've captured all of this. There's just no way. There's so much of this activity going on in this specific campaign that there's no way we've even seen everything as it's playing out. The second kind of way it's not exhaustive is there's so many different, unique, interesting ways that you can actually query the data to try and tease out different insights. And there's just not enough time here to obviously go through all of those and all the different ways we've addressed the data, the different questions that we've asked, and so on. And so please keep that in mind and understand this is also not conclusive. We're not making a definitive judgment as to the nature of the activity here. So we got two objectives in this presentation. The first is to provide an overview of the campaign as it was targeting the Hong Kong protests on social media. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the second is to demonstrate the importance of conducting your own collection when seeking to gain a more holistic understanding of this activity. And so really what I'm hoping to achieve here is to show you how we strive to at least get closer to the truth regarding the nature of these types of campaigns. Before I hand it over to Ryan, I've got one last slide here that I want to address. Recent impressions of the campaign. I kind of struggled to come up with a good title for this slide, but really this is some of the narratives that we've been seeing reported publicly regarding China's campaign. For example, that it primarily consisted of repurposed, relatively old spam social media accounts with kind of long-established histories and multiple different kind of eras of different types of activity. That there was very little outreach to social media users beyond kind of the insular networks of the accounts in the campaign itself. Third, that there was little in the way of hashtag promotion in terms of trying to perhaps push out messaging more broadly through the use of hashtags or the co-option of hashtags. And then finally that in terms of activity on different platforms, it was relatively insular and focused internally within kind of individual platforms themselves. So with that, I'm going to hand this, that's your clicker, and Ryan will take it away with the overview.
Great. So a few of the narratives that we have listed here are the most prominent that we observed throughout the campaign. This is not exclusive. So the first one being that the accounts were critical of the protesters. So for example, in the bottom middle of the screen here, you've got some English language accounts that are referring to the protesters as thugs. We also observed these accounts refer to the protesters as scumbags. What was interesting about the English language accounts was that some of them actually exclusively posted in English on at least one Twitter account, but on their own Twitter accounts and on other Twitter accounts, they were actually posting in Chinese. The second being supportive of the Hong Kong police. So for example, the Hong Kong police always executes the law justly. We saw numerous assets using this narrative. Calling on the protesters to peacefully protest. Numerous assets also shared this narrative, calling on protesters, if you're going to protest, please do it peacefully. Don't incite violence. The last one being accusations of foreign interference. So for example, the top middle of your screen, you'll see here in Chinese, you probably can't make out anything but the CIA. Some of you may be able to. Essentially alleging that the CIA was involved in orchestrating the protests, and other tweets that actually stated that Western countries more broadly were involved in orchestrating the protests. So we observed these text-based assets, we observed images depicting the protesters as violent and the policemen as heroic. We observed video-based assets. So these videos were voiced in Cantonese, they featured traditional Chinese text, and they portrayed the protesters as violent and the policemen as heroic. So we observed varying types of accounts. So for example, we observed repurposed spam accounts. So these accounts would exclusively post about follower services prior to then exclusively posting content surrounding the protests. Additionally, we observed what we assessed to be hijacked accounts. So for example, users that listed their location as Costa Rica, Bangladesh, and Brazil. The example on the left of your screen here is a user that listed their location as Brazil, posted in primarily Portuguese with some English, and then around the time of the protests in June, actually exclusively posted content in Chinese, and a sample of that is on the right side of that screenshot. One of her friends on the left side of the screenshot posted on her timeline claiming that her account had been compromised and that she was not doing the posting. Another type of account that we saw, accounts that we saw were accounts that were repurposed, that were tweeting content that was seemingly unrelated to the protests, but also was pertaining to China. So these accounts in the middle here actually tweeted in consecutive order, systematically promoting content that was critical of protesters and supportive of the police. We additionally observed accounts that were created seemingly for the purpose of this activity. So accounts that were created in June, some in May, in batches, on the same day, some within minutes of one another. And we're able to get that through the Twitter API. Lastly, we observed assets on Facebook that had no visible history, update their profile pictures to ethnically Asian-looking individuals, and exclusively post content regarding the protests. In some cases, it was identical content in consecutive order. So we observed additional evidence of state-run amplification. So on the left, you've got an account that actually plagiarized content from China Global Television Network. This is the English language verified account. On the right, this cluster of accounts actually was using an automated platform to systematically retweet content from China News Service, which is state-run. These accounts also, later in their history, around June, actually switched to exclusively promoting content surrounding the protest. So we observed identical content posted by accounts on all three platforms. So on the left, in consecutive order, actually, there are YouTube comments that are supportive of the Hong Kong police. In the middle, we have Facebook comments that are also supportive of the Hong Kong police. These are not in consecutive order, they were compiled together. And on the right, identical tweets in English. And what's interesting about these tweets is they refer to violence that had taken place on a certain day, but if you look carefully, they're actually 2 days apart, so July 15th and July 17th. So we also observed evidence of cross-platform coordination. So on your left, you'll see 2 Twitter accounts that shared these aforementioned videos that were voiced in Cantonese that were critical of the protesters. The replies to these videos were by the same individual. They were posted at the same time, and they are nearly identical to the YouTube comment at the bottom, with the exception of one additional sentence, and this sentence was actually critical of US politician Nancy Pelosi. In the middle, the top is a YouTube comment that matches identical with the 2 Facebook comments below it. On the right, the top is a Twitter comment. Below are the identical matches for Facebook comments. The comments in the middle regard support for the Hong Kong police. The screenshot on the right is regarding Hong Kong being a part of China. Additionally, we observed videos, identical videos, shared across all 3 platforms. These videos were shared under the same name, but also shared under other names. And we also saw additional identical videos shared under the same name and under different names. And lastly, we observed the reuse of profile pictures across multiple assets, across multiple platforms. Right, so this one is very interesting. We observed these pro-PRC accounts that were actually using pro-protester hashtags. So the hashtag was actually anti-ELAB, and that stands for Anti-Extradition Law Amendment Bill. These accounts use this hashtag to promote these videos that I mentioned earlier. On the left, on the right, additional videos were shared on Facebook. Below those are identical comments also using the hashtag.
Thank you. As I mentioned, one of the other objectives we wanted to achieve here was to highlight how it can be important and certainly useful as a researcher to conduct your own data collection and investigations as well, in addition to relying on what has been released publicly. As I said earlier, we don't have time to go into everything, so I'm going to give a single case study here as an example of this. And this is an analytic comparison of original tweets. And I selected this one because Twitter has done a very good job of releasing these large public data sets, and I really do think they should be commended for contributing in that way to help researchers get this better understanding. But given that volume, it also allows us to do some really cool, interesting things. And so in this exercise that I'm going to walk through, what we did here is we took Twitter's 2 public data releases. One was on August 19th, one was on September 20th. You see the approximately 14 million tweets there between the 2. And then we supplemented that with an additional 2.5 million tweets that we collected as well that are not present in the publicly released data. So this is additional insight, additional data. How did we collect those? Well, that's as part of our usual investigative process of identifying suspicious networks of activity, accounts that are part of them, getting the content to try and dig into it and to see kind of what is happening there. And so we started collecting this in early June when the protests really started to erupt. They kind of got started in April, but really started to erupt in June. So we started collecting then, but it does include pre-June material. And what we do is we compile all of this data together to take an LDA topic modeling approach. This is a machine learning topic modeling approach. To try to identify content of interest to investigate further. So as I said earlier, this is all about trying to move us closer to the truth. And so what is LDA? I mean, in its simplest form, imagine that I lay out 50 empty buckets in front of you right now, and you've got 2.5 million tweets that you need to put into those buckets, and you want to put them into the buckets based on their similarity to each other in terms of content, and the one condition you have is that every bucket has to have at least one tweet in it. That's effectively what we did in this exercise. And so this is the breakdown of the data. Because we're trying to get at what was actually happening with regards to the Hong Kong protests and not, kind of what are these Chinese accounts doing in general, we start to subset different sets. So firstly, we subset everything. We're only interested in activity after April 1st. That's random, arbitrary, but that's what we opt for here. So you can see the breakdown there. 5% of Twitter's release falls into that bucket. 83% of our collection falls into that. That's expected because, the public access to this data tends to, by definition, skews to its most recent because there are limits on how much you can obtain. We then subset down to only original tweets. Retweets are important, obviously, from an amplification perspective, but what we're trying to do is really get at what is the original content being promoted here. So you can see the percentage breakdowns there. We then train the LDA on 50 topics with the breakdown, as you see there, 49%. That's done with stratified sampling to ensure that we're not overrepresenting particularly high-volume accounts when we're trying to discern the different topics being addressed. And we train this on 50 topics. Now, think about this as empty clusters. We don't go in here and we say, OK, find me Hong Kong stuff. We say, I want to fill up 50 empty buckets, break it down like that. We choose 50 because it provides enough diversity to ensure we're teasing out different subjects, but we don't get too diverse that we can't kind of pull generalizable insights from it. And so once we've done that, we then we predictively label the remaining data on the trained model so that we have all of the tweets in that data set labeled together. And you can see the breakdown here. I'm going to go into the topics in a second, but effectively what we identified was 12 Hong Kong related topics, 12 China, politics, national security type related topics, and 26 other topics. That's where you're going to find all of your spam and things like that. And so we're interested in Hong Kong, so we're taking the 230,000 tweets that were binned into the 12 Hong Kong topics, and that came 60,000 from the publicly released data and 170,000 from our independently collected data. And so here are the topic breakdowns here. On the left, for you ML nerds in the crowd, these are the TF-IDF weighted beta values for each topic. For you non-ML nerds, this is effectively what were the most important words in terms of differentiating the topics, not what was necessarily the most prominent word in those topics. So the model is deciding based on these effectively as to what bucket they're going to put into. And on the right, we provided this breakdown of where the data is coming from, the publicly released versus the independently collected. And so we can see some really interesting things here. These labels are probably going to be hard to see, but I'm going to choose topic 10, topic 30, and topic 42 as an example. In topic 10, what's interesting here is we see quite a few named verified Twitter accounts. So maybe this suggests there's actually some sort of active attempts to reach out to specific individuals regarding this campaign. In topic 30, what's really interesting there, you can see, way more data coming from the independently collected set than the publicly released set. That's English language content regarding the Hong Kong protests. So some unique insights there as well. And then 42 as well, if I remember correctly, is kind of related to kind of the police and arrests and students and so on. So again, it could indicate some things there. We validated all of these topics. So not only do we look at the actual determining words in the TF-IDF plots there, we actually randomly sample tweets that have been bucketed into those buckets, manually review them with our analysts to ensure that they do appear to be related. Just as a side incident, this is what we did for China as well. There's some Guo Wengwei stuff down there. There's been a lot of reporting about how some of these accounts also promoted anti-Guo Wengwei, he's a Chinese dissident messaging. That's captured here, as is kind of random Chinese politics stuff. And so we've now got these two really interesting data sets we can start to compare. So we've got the publicly released data, the 60,000. And then set two, what we chose to do was combine that publicly released data with our additionally collected data because we're trying to demonstrate how your own collection can help complement this analysis and develop further insights. So here's some interesting things here, right? This is the account age distribution from the sets. The top one is the publicly released data, the middle one is from our independently collected data, and then the bottom chart there is the combined. These are binned by 100-day intervals, which I think we backdated from October 28th of last year. So what is really interesting here is the second bars in each of those charts. Between 100 and 200 days prior to October 28th fills the time frame of mid-April to mid-July. So this is really when the protests are really starting to pick up. And so what this suggests is that the accounts in our data that were actively promoting messaging regarding the Hong Kong protests, many of those were created specifically for that purpose. They were created in that time window. And so that calls into question, the general conclusion as, are these all spam accounts that have just been repurposed? This could suggest that actually there's a lot more original dedicated accounts being created as well. We can look at the following distributions in the same manner. So on the left here, from the publicly released data, in the middle, the independently collected, and then on the right, combined. Obviously, there's this huge gap in the middle on the left there, which our data help fills in. And so on this left-hand graph, you have all of these accounts that have very few followers and very few followings, kind of probably the random ones created for whatever purpose. Probably a lot of the really new ones there as well that haven't had an opportunity to actually build an audience. And then at the top, you have the kind of 10,000 plus followers and following. These are likely kind of just big automated spam accounts that are all retweeting each other and so on. And so what our data does here is it just fills in those gaps a bit and suggests maybe we should investigate some of these middle accounts as they exhibit follower-following behavior more consistent with what you would expect from kind of the less obviously automated accounts. We can also pull out interesting content-related data. We just did account-level data. Now we can pull out content-related data in terms of who was being mentioned, who was being replied to. And you can see here, this racing bar chart will eventually plot up, and we've extracted some examples there. The translations are Google Translate, so don't blame us. We didn't have time to go and do them properly. But what's very interesting here, you very quickly see, is quite large-scale mentioning and replies to media entities, VOA Chinese, BBC Chinese, NYT Chinese, with anti-protester, pro-police messaging. This would suggest there were coordinated efforts, or potentially there were coordinated efforts to actually try to influence the readers of social media accounts. There's also Donald Trump in there as well. I think he said something controversial, and then they all jumped on him, so he blows up in the data set on a particular day. But you can see here, right, what's interesting here is this is really communicating that perhaps the conclusion that there was an outreach from this network may warrant further investigation. The suggestions that there were efforts to reach out to specific audiences. You can do the same with the hashtag usage as well. This data's dirtier. There's some random crap still in there still. Blackpink, for example, I think is a South Korean pop band. I'll remind you that the LDA is a probabilistic, unsupervised model, so you are going to get some garbage in there regardless, right? And the volumes we're talking about, we don't think that affects the overall thing, and you'll see that quickly drops out. But as you can see, there are particular pushes of hashtags, including the anti, that's the bad translation there, again, that's automated, but the anti ELAB hashtag, that was the pro-protester hashtag that was co-opted by accounts that we assessed to be part of this campaign being operated to support PRC state interests. And so, again, some examples down there that you can see the kind of generic pro-police, anti-protester commentary regarding foreign influence, and so on. And so, insights and takeaways, that's my fancy way of saying in conclusion. What we were trying to show here is that we're trying to show that by collecting your own data, complementing it with the publicly released data, you can try to drive closer to the truth in terms of what these campaigns actually were trying to achieve. Now, as I said, this is not conclusive. It warrants a whole much more investigation, but interesting insights there nonetheless. I believe I'm out of time, so we won't have time for questions. while I do have the stage, I just want to say thank you to Ryan. Ryan is a junior analyst on my team. He's only been with us for a year and a half, came straight from his internship. For him to stand up in this room with the caliber of people in this, in this field, really, kudos to him and for the work that he's put into this. So thank you, Ryan.